Okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to session 3J, which is exploring heritage connections, islands, and Nigeria, colonial struggles, and beyond. My name is Abigail Gomez, and I'm your chair this afternoon. With me is Ambassador Ryan, the Irish ambassador to Nigeria, Dr. Jimo from Federal University, and KB, and Mr. Ola Chibosashwe, SDM. Welcome, gentlemen. When this panel was being brought together, there were questions about that. Why this panel? Because in Nigeria, not many people really appreciate the fact that Ireland has a colonial history. So I'd like to start with perhaps Ambassador telling us a bit about just 5 minutes on Irish colonial history. And then I'm going to ask Mr. Zachary, since he has the whole film about this, about Nigeria's colonial history, and then we'll go into stuff. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Duque. It's great to be here. Appreciate the privilege of it, and commend the organisers here on their incredible act of, never mind the technology involved, just the pure human to gather us all together. It's great. I'm just looking at the number of people in the room and online. You know, over the 800 years of British colonial rule in Ireland, many a revolution started with even smaller people than the numbers that are in this room. So we never let that deter us. We had an overnight success, I suppose, of our independence movement that took a mere 800 years. It was a very funny story when the British troops were marching out of Dublin in 2022. They were marching out of what we call a police barracks, or an army base, army camp. I've seen a few army camps around here, similar sort of thing. And they were marching out trying to be quite formal and so on. And remember, they were handing over to people who had been a guerrilla army, who were the exact opposite of formality. We're not interested in formality. We wanted to create a new republic, a new way of operating. And the person who was handing over the barracks formally to the new Irish army was standing looking at his watch. The handover was supposed to be at 12 p.m., 12 noon. 12:01 passes by, 12:02 passes by, and at 12:08, the Irish side arrived to take charge of the base, to say goodbye to the people they were trying to kill up until a couple of weeks before, and many of whom were Irish, which is an interesting part of the story as well. And the British general looks at his watch and says to the Irish guy, who had been the most wanted man in Ireland up until a couple of weeks before, and he said, "General Collins, you're 8 minutes late." And General Collins replied to him and said, "Well, we've had to wait 800 years." So I think our story is a complex one. It might look quite simple in a lot of ways, but it's quite a complex one. The British were invited to, or the Normans were invited to come to Ireland actually by an Irish chief, a guy called Dermot McMorrow, who feared that he had lost his land, so he invited the Normans. He thought it seemed like a good idea, and he invited them, and they essentially never left, which is kind of interesting, and they came in different ways. And the colonial experience was quite a mixed one. At times it was largely an absentee rule, but at other times it was a very concentrated and focused rule. And really, I suppose the area that is of particular relevance to us at the moment in Ireland is the years leading up to the foundation of the state in 1922. And we're just about to complete the commemorative period, a decade of commemorations around that period. And that's leading right up to the end of the Civil War in Ireland. So we had a civil war that followed our War of Independence. So our independence wasn't granted to us. It had to be won by force of arms, which was quite a traditional way in Ireland of demonstrating the desire for Irish people to be independent of an independent voice. But look, what's really interesting about the decade commemorations and the approach to it is, what's underpinned it is this sense of ethical remembrance and this sense that there are multiple narratives. There is no linear story to the Irish colonial experience. It's probably no linear story to most things in life, but to be able to apply the sort of sophisticated knowledge that we have today, the access to multiple sources and resources now, and to apply new methods of learning has been something that's underpinned our decade of commemorations. We tried to do that in a way that doesn't add to misunderstandings or division between Irish people today and British people today, but that in fact helps us to shape a better future where we're able to look more carefully together at our shared history, but to do that in a way that's going to improve the way that we live together right now. And the reason why that's really important is because of a thing called Brexit, as you remember, that came along and reintroduced a border on the island of Ireland at a time when we thought a border was gone. And suddenly these things became real. Suddenly this is not an academic conversation because the words have consequences and actions have consequences outside in people's lives. So we've had a wonderful experience of doing that. And that's why I'm really so happy to be here, because so much of the expertise that's been shared here over the course of 2 or 3 days has been mirrored in Ireland. So our decade of commemorations was not led by the government. The government are one of the partners in it. It was led by experts in these fields. It was led by artists, writers, historians, trade unionists. It was led in a national conversation about it. And we hope that it's led to some healing in our country. We hope it's led to the inclusion, for example, of women and other lesser acknowledged groups in our history, in our narrative. We never heard about the role of women in our independence movement. We never heard about the prevalence of sexual violence in the colonial rule in Ireland. It was not discussed. It just simply wasn't in a history book. The decade of commemorations has demonstrated to us these narratives are important. The phrase I love that has informed the entire shaping of the decade of commemorations, which involves lots of things that traditionally people wouldn't have been comfortable commemorating, was a beautiful phrase. I really love it. And it's called the hospitality of narratives. It's about saying the state can commemorate all it likes, but there's another narrative. In fact, there might be multiple narratives, and there should be a place for all of those. So that's been a fantastic learning experience for us in Ireland. We've got international best practices part of that, and I think there's lots to discuss and to learn from in this part of the world, very special part of the world for us. Thanks.
Ambassador is anything you say, independence, civil war, religious right, women's studies, uh, trade union struggles. If I had that conversation with you when you go as a goal, it is right. That's why you lose people. So perhaps just because we have no audience, kind of perhaps round up our history and sort of speak to almost like the middle points that Ambassador has brought up.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. It's great to be here. This is a great idea of the panel. And the connecting factors between Ireland and Nigeria surprised many, and I'm sure at the end of this session, you'll have a lot of people scampering onto Google to check out what they can find out. But honestly, there was a lot more intention. Irish colonization from my eyes that I see. Nigeria, we kind of made it up as they were going along. The whole concept of Nigeria. There was intention to colonize and to get wealth from a certain part of Africa, but to create the whole body of territory that is now known as Nigeria was a sequence of events. And I can scarcely find any one person that says, I thought of this 20 years before it happened. And it was just like happening from a sequence of events. Many of those events started in faraway Berlin when the attempt was trying to be made to carve out your own portion of what everybody knew was rich in much needed raw material and natural resources on the European continent. So as much as the desire was to get a piece of Africa, it was also a desire to keep the French out, to keep the Germans out, and to keep this for British possession. And it all started to Mana in Lagos, and it has grown from then on. And Adika is absolutely right in saying that along the way, a lot of actors played different roles in ensuring the deepening of the colony. And a lot of people sort of carved out their own niche in ensuring that the period of occupation, it wasn't an absenteeism, it was an occupied colonial was as uncomfortable as it could be for the colonizers. And you'll find littered across Nigeria's history many ordinary and unsung heroes who are not motivated by the events of the day, but their daily struggles became events in themselves. And you find women populate a lot of our history, the struggles towards the end of independence. A remarkable number of women involved in that struggle. I tell people that when I set out to write a platter of gold, a modest book that I wrote about Nigerian history, I set out to write the story of the lives of the 8 governors that led the administration of Nigeria over the 100 years. And while writing out their biography, as I thought I was, a lot of people jumped at me that I hadn't thought about before, and most of them were women. So I quickly pushed the biography of the governors generals to the back and brought out the real story of Nigerians that we didn't much know about. And the trade unions played their role. The press was extremely important. The Africans, as they were called then, because there was no Nigeria, in 1863 had started newspapers, and newspapers for the educated and the not so educated, translated into local languages, and there were veritable information centers for mobilizing and just educating themselves about what was going on in different parts of the country. And to Nigerians, it still has a paradoxical sort of ambivalence when you ask people, particularly the elderly, what was the colonial experience like? And some people remember it with fondness. Some people remember it as a time of great enlightenment and education and fun and music and waltzing and tea and cricket. And some people remember it as a time of struggle where the villages were collectively punished by scheme that the British colonizers had invented. It was by no means a British philosophy to collectively punish a village for the transgressions of one man. and those kind of things. So there's still this, there was some good with bad conversation that still permeates. But um, I'm not sure how much of that we share with the Irish, but nevertheless, there are many connections, and I can't wait to get into the conversation.
I think that your comment of the good and the bad, I think I'd like to bring a person who is really quite unique into this conversation. Dr. Jimo, Roger Casement, Irish hero, British villain, but he was here in Nigeria. Tell us about him and how do you see his role? Before I ask Ambassador and Mr. Shashwe to comment.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jimo. Roger Casement, a different character to different people. Roger Casement is different thing to the British authority, not the British populace, to distinguish the British establishment, colonial establishment. Roger Casement was a different character to the Nigerian people, especially the people of old Calabar province. Then Roger Casement was a different character to the Irish ordinary people. He was a young man who came into Nigeria through the colonial service. He was employed as part of the colonial civil servants establishment. But after his employment, he was posted to Calabar, where he worked with this guy, McDonald. The uniqueness of Roger Casement, perhaps one of the early colonial officers who mapped a whole area of Nigeria called the Calabar province. And if we understand the importance of map in colonial history, map goes beyond drawing of lines on the table and what have you. It actually gives you the details of territorial endowment in terms of resources, in terms of military strategy as well, in terms of location of whatever you want to do with that territory. So it came up with a wonderful map for the British colonial authority. But the uniqueness of Roger Casement actually happened with his encounter, the first encounter he had with the local people. Given the history of how typical colonial officials reacted to obstruction, especially when they're on official duty, then you begin to wonder, was Roger Casement a typical colonial official? Because when it was obstructed by the Calabar people, the people in the Calabar province, rather than employing the instrumentality of British imperial forces, he was sympathetic to their cause. In his writings, when you look at his writings and you ask yourself, what configured his worldview towards the local people as against what the British official would ordinarily do if such situation were to be, in the mood of regard or in the mood of Rahman, the notorious guy in Benin. But to the Calabar people, he came up with a very nice, detailed story of local history, the sociological makeup of that area, and probably the first anthropological notes that any colonial official will come up with was actually documented by Roger Casement, especially the Opobo, the old Calabar province, and of course along the Bight of Benin and the present Niger Delta.
And that's not something that is well known.
And at that time, it was not well known. Even up to now, his contribution to the mapping of that area probably have been consigned to the footnote of history in Nigeria. Not many Nigerian historians actually gave prominence to activities of Roger Casement in spite of the centrality of his work to the success of British imperial projects in Calabar province. And again, you want to ask yourself the difference between Roger Casement, who worked in Calabar province, and the guy who went to Congo and later went back to Britain and Ireland. I mean, you have different three characters that span three different, phases across three geographies with a different characteristic and different historical trajectory. It was in Congo, Leopold, Congo, King Leopold, and that is where he started his fraternization with Africans. I mean, given what he saw in Congo and the horrors he saw in Congo, and given his own experience as an Irishman, then there was a connection. Because if you are coming out of an oppressed society and you find yourself in a space where people are being oppressed, there is a natural instinct to have a kind of connection. And the first phase of his life in Nigeria, the second phase of his life in Congo, and the final phase of his life in Britain and in Ireland, it's something that is very, very amazing, given the fact that he worked for the British establishment, and of course, he was later, in my own word, murdered by the British establishment. I think we'll get more into that.
Yes. Ambassador, is it fair to say that Roger Casement is an Irish hero?
Oh yeah, undoubtedly, he's everyone in Ireland would have an attachment to him, to his story. We'd know his story. We wouldn't know the Nigerian aspect of the story, which is also interesting. We'd know the Congo piece. We'd know the South American piece. I think he got the Congo piece he got his knighthood or whatever he got from the King of England for the Congo piece. But then he was the last prisoner held in the Tower of London, taken and executed, and it took the Irish state. Can you imagine? So he was executed in London, taken from the Tower of London, and executed in 1916, and his body wasn't released back to Ireland until 1965. So it was the #1 item on the Irish government's agenda in its negotiations with Britain. Can you imagine? From 1922, from the foundation of the state until 1965. And we brought him home in 1965. He got a state funeral. The whole country stopped. He got a state funeral. But he's a really interesting guy for lots of reasons. And it brings me back to that thing about the good and the bad of empire. Mm-hmm. Is his big sin the fact that he became, is his memory in some way, or his life in some way, colored by the fact that he was part of the British colonial machine, which he undoubtedly was? Or does he wipe that clean for the things that he does in Africa? And then does he really wipe it clean by giving up his life, essentially? So he arrives into the equivalent of, if you can imagine, he was in a German submarine. The British government is at war with Germany. He arrives in a German submarine to bring weapons to a remote beach in Ireland. And he's told that the Germans won't, there's nobody there to meet the submarine, but he says, I'll go in on my own. So essentially, he signed his own death warrant, and he came in on his own. The people who were supposed to meet him had a traffic accident, and he literally bumps into the policeman. He literally bumps into them in a really remote place. They bring him, they can't believe their luck. They bring him to London, and because he was a knight of the realm, the British really went after him. Had he been somebody else, there's a question whether they would have just put him in jail, keep him quiet, commuted his sentence. But the fact that he was a knight of the realm was a big problem for them, because he was famous for the Congo, and because he was famous what he'd done in South America, he was the darling in many ways of the British Empire, of the British kind of, the Oscar Wilde, the successors to Oscar Wilde, in the salons and in the comfortable houses and all these people. He was a party guy. He was around all this. He was a prolific correspondent. But for me, anyway, it's very interesting that there's a good and the bad there, because the reality is that he was part of a British colonial machine here, as many Irish people were, and many of the people who were executed with him, who, like him, didn't have a proper trial or conventional trial, or barely got to meet their defense, for example, just the standards of normal conduct of justice at that time weren't complied with. And most of the people who were executed didn't even have a defense. They had a military court. Often at night time, very quick, thank you, take them out and execute them straight away. And that, because Britain is at war, so that's, these are the things sometimes that happen in war or whatever. But anyway, what's really interesting for me is that the thing that he undertook here was mapping. Because one of our greatest playwrights is a guy called Brian Friel. And if we go to the English department here, they'll know all about him. Because he wrote a play, he was trying, when at the height of the trouble in Ireland in the 1970s, people tried to pull the writers and pull the artists and pull the intelligentsia into being in one side or another side the whole time. They'd say, you have to speak out about this atrocity. You have to say Irish is wrong or the British are wrong or whatever it might be. And Seamus Heaney and others absolutely refused to be dragged. They said, we're in the middle ground here and we're going to be equally, we hope, insightful about what we see in society. And Brian Friel is a writer from County Tyrone in the north of Ireland. And he used to go on his holidays to his mother's place in Donegal, a very beautiful place in the top left of Ireland. That was because of the partition of Ireland and the trouble in Ireland was cut off from its urban centre. So imagine 3,000 years it had an urban centre and universities and everything, and suddenly, no, they're not in Ireland anymore, they're in Britain now. Okay, and you're not British anymore, by the way, you're Irish now, and your neighbour's British. Okay. So Friel was trying to make sense of this, and trying to make sense of it in a contemporary setting while not denying what had happened in the past. And Heaney said to him, go away and write about it. So Brian Friel went away and he came up with a play called Translation, which is one of the most famous plays in the English language. And if you haven't read it, you've seen its forebears because it permeates English literature and world literature and world theatre. And the reason is very simple. He set the play in Donegal, in the Irish-speaking area of Ireland, in the 1830s, just before free schooling comes for the majority of people in Ireland. Just a decade before the Great Hunger. But things are difficult, things are tough. The old world is changing. The traditional schools in the field and in the barn are going to be taken over by this colonial measure of primary schools, which of course the church is in the middle of course they are. And into this mix comes a group of people from Britain who are going to draw a map of the area. And because they have their technical knowledge, funnily enough, they're from the army. They're from the technical corps of the army. And they come, of course, with their mindset and all the rest. And they work with the locals. But the reason why all the theatre experts in the world know that play is because it was the first time that we had the English people speaking English on the stage. We had the Irish people speaking English, but you're imagining that they're speaking Irish. And he put a translator in the middle. English, 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 and they still can't understand each other. Amazing, powerful. And his point was, if you haven't lived and you haven't experienced what we've experienced, you can't come in from outside without absolute upheaval in something as easy as a name place. So there's a bit of a love story, and there's everything in it. It's very funny. It's a very funny play. And it's disruptive in the way we would conventionally think about things. And the British Army, of course, they can't understand. They think the Irish will think this is wonderful because it will be a chance to map resources and all that. Whereas the Irish are looking at this going, are you joking? You've taken our land, you've taken our language, you've taken our culture, you've taken everything from us, and now you're here to help us? Really? But that's done in a very provocative way. And I'd love to see Cason's work in a way kind of explored in that light. Maybe we need more scholarship on it. Maybe it's possible, maybe it's not possible, I don't know. But it's fascinating what you've shared with us, and thank you for that. Thank you.
Mr. Chatterton.
Roger Casement.
Roger Casement, because I know he's a hero of yours, but also to respond to Ambassador, your comment on the army, his comment on the army, because something you said in Part of Gold once, and it struck me as something that we don't often think about, how colonialism is an army of occupation.
Yes.
It's an army of
military rule.
yes, it's military rule, but it's dressed up
Yes.
in
Benign.
yes, under, have some schooling, have some church, have afternoon tea, have a map. Yes, and I think it's interesting that in Ireland it was so much more clearly, I think, occupational in a way that perhaps it wasn't here so much. I'd like you to speak to that.
Yeah, okay. But can I just start with
Yes,
this?
yes.
Because you're right. Somebody's fascinated me for a bit now. And I first came across him reading King Leopold's story, and I thought, I closed the book and I thought, what a guy. Great guy. Nothing to do with me, but fantastic guy. And then I was reading Mary Kingsley, who many of you would know, was a great traveler of West Africa and very fond of Nigeria. She had her own issues, but was a fairly balanced character for her time. And Casement shows up again, and I said, hang on, this is that guy. And I thought, can't be a coincidence. And then I started literally chasing Casement all over the place. What I found that I would depart slightly from the earlier speakers is that I'm not sure he's as black and white as good or bad. I think he evolved. And what you might call good and bad sides of him was just his evolutionary process as a child. My story about him starts at the age of 19 in Liverpool, and there's a connection between Liverpool and Ireland. And the ambassador will tell us more about that. I support the football team, so I know Liverpool, that is not Everton. Now, he shows up in Liverpool, where I need to get this very clear, where his maternal uncle and virtually his stepfather, a guy called the Bannister, works for the West African shipping merchants. A very well-known. No.
It's the same person.
No, a company called West African Shipping Merchants.
No, the stepfather and the maternal uncle are the same person.
Yes, same person.
Okay.
Now, his paternal uncle. His paternal uncle was a prominent director in a rival company, right? His maternal uncle worked for a company, very famous company called Hatton Groups. But his paternal grandfather worked for the rivals called Elder Dempster.
Oh.
And so he's in the dockside of Liverpool, and no surprise, his first job at 19 was a clerk in Elder Dempster Line. No surprise that by 1884, he made 3 trips to West Africa, right? On an Elder Dempster ship called SS Bonnie. Now, he never went ashore for more than the normal stops, but he was already comfortable with West Africa. He already understood, and this was at a very young age. He wasn't to go to Congo until he was 22, when he joined the Irish the association. The so-called the African Association created by King Leopold. And for me, it shows you this evolutionary process. So traveling, going to foreign lands, West Africa was something that he was introduced to very early. And so that by the time he was joining the Protectorate Service as a young diplomat, and he was sent to West Africa for the first time, he'd already been to Congo, but only very briefly. His travels in West Africa, as Dr. Duane said, took him to the southeastern part of the country, Opobo and Calabar area. But I think a lot of things, connect him. A lot of his life connected him to what he later became. So his compassion for the natives of a place that he was visiting, and he knew he was part of a structure of domination, albeit the better side of it, working for the Protectorate was civil service, unlike the Royal Niger Company, which was a notorious bunch of bandits, as far as I'm concerned. Right, so just pure bandits. And he worked with a guy called Claude MacDonald, who history is very kind to. And he was the consul general of the Oil Rivers Protectorate, which later became the Niger Delta Protectorate. Again, these are people who were opposed to the Royal Niger's practices of shoot your way into trade. They were more about the discussion and discussion and discussion. So you could see the compassion coming out of them. And I'm not saying that being part of the colonial service was a great thing to do, but fixed in his time, this was a job that he had been given. And all his travels, he never traveled with an armed group of people. He went about thinking he could talk with them. And as Jim has pointed out, he got him into a spot of trouble. And he was taken hostage. He made very light of it. What we're blessed with is a great collection of diaries that he left behind. And so we naturally know what he was experiencing. And a lot of the people in colonial service just left the record. Some of them took the records to even deny what they'd done. But he left copious records. So I wanted to stress that this was a man who evolved into patriotism. When he remarked in 1907 that all the while I had remained an incorrigible Irishman, as if there was some this was some other something to say. Yeah, I've remained an incorrigible Irishman.
But just to hold you there, that's a feeling that perhaps he felt he was struggling to remain an Irishman
Absolutely.
against the colonialism back in Ireland, and the fact that he's being torn.
Absolutely. This I think supports my theory of his evolution. And not that he had good and bad sides. He always felt that there was something wrong about what he was doing. And his 1904 report of and this is another connection that I think is very important for people who study case law in the future. Another connection is that his report in 1904 of the atrocities in Congo led to the creation of a phrase called crimes against humanity.
Yes.
Now, it also did something else. It turns the entire continent of Europe against Belgium. And it set a moral standard of what not to do. What not to do in your colony. Do everything else, but don't amputate people. Don't take it to the level of Belgium. Now, this might be precious little to a bunch of people who are in occupation. But trust me, if it cost you your limbs and your life, it was a lot at the time when people weren't complaining about much that was going on in a continent that was referred to as a dark continent, that nobody knew what was going on. So I by no means finished my chasing of Kingsman. I'm still after him. But I've come to try and connect certain things in his life to what he later did, and not look at what he later did or what he did before in isolation. And I think that evolution for me was my revelation. I'm talking about the occupation of colonies distinguished from remote governments, which is what we call today neo-colonialism, where you're actually still under the colonial yoke, but you're not under occupation. And I'm not sure there was much of a difference. Because culturally, we're speaking English in this room, and the ambassador has a totally different language from English. And I have a totally different language from English. And yet, this is the heritage that we both share from colonial.
I saw you both taking notes.
I just want to chip in something about again casement, and well, I think casement to us in Africa was part of colonial establishment. But again, within the British colonial civil service, it was an Irish. It was never trusted in his judgment. Even within it works for the British, he was an Irish. Here, they consider him as a rebel within the British colonial empire. To the extent that most of his work were credited to MacDonald. Most of his works, its mapping works, its ethnographical work, and all the notes.
But it was his boss.
It was his boss. But again, if you work for your boss, you need some acknowledgement. Casement was totally erased by the British. When you look at correspondences that went from the Niger Delta Protectorate to the to the colonial office, you hardly see some reference to Casement's work. 80% of mapping of the Niger Protectorate were done by Casement. Right from when, if you look at how he left the British, how he left West Africa, especially Nigeria, he resigned under a very, turbulent circumstances. Such documentation, the British never document what led to his resignation. And again, the disagreement with MacDonald was never documented because, so when you look at this character, like the earlier speaker said, it's evolvement. But during this process of evolution, my own understanding and reading of him is that he remained an Irish. All through the evolutionary period, he remained an Irish. And that perhaps, brings us to the issue of loyalty. Loyalty, and if you look at his work on human rights and how he raised the bar of moral conduct within the British and European Empire generally, globally, either in Europe or in South America, then we can see a connection between Casement's works in Congo and Casement compassion with the people of Niger Delta Protector, because it was held hostage for weeks. And he never, imagine a colonial official being taken hostage right at the heat of empire, brutal imperial domination. When you just oppose that with what happened in Benin. With Rafmon, then we have to look at Casement from different perspectives as against a typical colonial official.
And the expected reaction to
and the expected reaction, yes.
Ambassador, I saw you scribbling.
Yeah, no, look, I think I was writing down some of those key words around evolution, around loyalty and so on. I think one of the things, Casement in a way is a man for all ages, I would say, in a way. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. He goes to Germany on his own bat, not with a mandate necessarily from the revolutionary leadership, but with encouragement. And he goes and he meets the Irish-born deserters from the British Army. And he goes around German prisons, meeting Irish prisoners, saying to them, "We're going to have a revolution in Ireland." It's like he's living a stage play. He's been in Africa, beautifully dressed, beautifully turned out. He's in LGBT circles, as they call them nowadays. He's in very advanced, sophisticated intellectual circles, salons, the whole world. He's comfortable in that circle, but he doesn't feel of it, although he's in it. Really interesting. Even in the middle of it in British society, he's a knight of the realm. So when he turns up, they open the door and he goes in and he sits in the clubs and everything. And then he goes off and he visits the prisons in Germany, which is in a way quite typical of Irish revolutionary thinkers, because they did that with Napoleon, they did that in King Louis's court, they did it in King Philip's court, everywhere they could, with Britain in the perspective that Britain's enemy is my friend. So he goes to Germany. The Germans don't know what to make of him at all, but they let him visit prisons. And in the prisons, he's almost attacked by the Irish people who are in the British Army, who say, you're being doubly traitorous.
You're not just traitors to Britain, who gave you a job for 20 years or whatever, but you're being a traitor to the Irish people because our best interests lie in the British Empire. Of course, and the argument is always, how can we feed and clothe ourselves if we're not? It's not an emotional argument. It's not an argument to say these are our people, we are the same people. It's really interesting. So he comes back with 0 recruits. He doesn't get a single recruit. And in a way, that cements his place in the pantheon of Irish revolutionary leaders. The point is, in a way, that he didn't need recruits because he's engaged in something bigger, which is really interesting. Kind of, you notice it after the fact. I'm sure he didn't feel like it when it was happening to him. He comes back. He's on a U-boat, early submarine. He's on the wild Atlantic water, the same Atlantic that washes here. It's a bit wilder up our way, and a bit colder, a lot colder. And he's got, I don't know, 20,000 rifles or something on this U-boat. Nobody comes to meet him. So the captain says, well, I'm going back to Germany. I'm out of here because the British are going to get me. What are you doing? You're coming back? And he said, no, let me off, knowing what's going to happen. And the guy scuttles the U-boat and it's sent to the bottom of the ocean. And Caseman's arrested. And what happens when he's arrested? George Bernard Shaw, who's the leading intellectual in Britain at the time, one of the leading intellectuals, also Irish. Shaw, and a playwright and one of the founders of the Fabian Society, the economist, the London School of Economics, all these things, one of the great thinkers of his age. Shaw says, I will conduct your defense. I will go into the Old Bailey, and if it's a drama you want for the ages, I will give you a drama for the ages, and we will put the British state on trial. And Casey says, you're out of your tiny mind. I'm going to have a more conventional defense. I don't really have time to be part of this service. And he has visitors to the Tower of London, which is like a who's who from the society papers in London. And probably a lot of people thought they won't execute the guy because he's too much of their system. But it's really interesting question about his loyalty and about that. And to give you an idea why that's a man for all ages is today, the LGBT nature of his friendships, his lifestyle and so on, was something that was airbrushed of Irish history. When that was raised at the time, that was seen as the British slandering him because society recognized we can't execute this guy after everything he's done about slavery, about Congo, about everything else. We can't execute him. So they said, well, suddenly they find a diary or whatever it is and say, well, look, okay, in that case, we can execute it. So Irish people, it was very natural for everybody to deny that. But we know now, that's what I said at the very start about modern scholarship, sophisticated, in-depth investigations, new sources, all kinds of sources. We know now that his life was a bit more complex than most of us might live, if you like. There was a lot going on. There was a lot going on in his life. And he wrote about it. He talked about it. When his body was brought back to Ireland in 1965, he had said specifically before he was executed where he wanted to be buried. He wanted to be buried with a view off the very northern tip of the island of Ireland, where you can see Scotland from on a clear day. Look out the window, you can see Scotland. He wanted to be buried there. That's where his people are from. And his family didn't want him. The family did not want him home. And there's still no monument to this day where his family are from. So a man for the ages is somebody who takes the opposite, sometimes evolves over time and takes the opposite turn to the turn his family went. His family, his circle, it was the really unpopular thing to have done. And he did it. And yet, I think in modern times, his family probably get great, I suppose, comfort or great pride in what he did, not only what he did internationally, but I think when they look at the journey that Ireland has made, they say, wow, we've managed to have 100 years of unbroken democracy. We've managed grow our population for the first time in 150 years. We've managed not to invade anybody. We've managed to have our peacekeepers in every corner of the world. Unbroken service for 65 years, a tiny little country. We managed to spend more money overseas on development partnership on this continent than any country probably in the world per head of population. We've sent more teachers and educators to this continent than any country per capita. It's kind of remarkable. And I think Casement and his approach to give ourselves a chance to shape our future, I think is vindicated through that in a small way. But it doesn't change the complexity, the evolution,
Yes.
and everything else.
Yeah.
And warts and all, still Casement.
Yes. And I think I'd like to pick up on that last. In fact, that was the other part. So yes, I think that I'd like to pick up one comment you made there. In the island, over the 100 years, seems to be coming to terms with its colonial history in a way, and this is now for Mr. Shashwe and Dr. Jimo. Have we come to terms with our colonial history? Can we? Are we? Is it still too fresh, or was it? Is it something that we haven't yet scratched off? Look at us, we are wearing suits. I mean, yeah.
I'm moving.
That's part of colonial heritage.
Yeah.
A bit like why we're speaking English. But yeah, I think there is an issue with how we've applied ourselves to our colonial history. We haven't come to terms. The level of scholarship, in fact, the level of information coming out from central government, from the federal government, is absolutely superficial. I mean, you need to visit the Ministry of Information, or you need to have been around when we were commemorating, some people said celebrating 100 years of British rule in 2014.
Yeah, 2014, yeah.
And the information was wrong. I was in the State House in Asarok for the inauguration ceremony. There are pictures of people. It's wrong. You know, there's a picture of Donald Cameron, and that's not Donald Cameron. Do you understand? So the level of scholarship and the desire to really have the rigor to have accurate information about our colonial history and our past. It seems to be something that, and I think I said this in the documentary, where it's almost as if it didn't exist. It's benign. We don't even like to talk about slave trade. We don't even like to talk about the number of people who were killed in Aba and the number of real people who were killed in Iba Valley. We just pretend, you know, there's a tiny little skirmishes. There were thousands of people killed in the battle with Atahira and Mughal.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of people were killed. And nobody even talks about it as a national part of our national memory. I'm not saying have a day for it, but nobody even talks about the battle to Sokoto as a pivotal point in the creation of Nigeria.
Oh, that's even a site to go and visit.
So yeah, as a site to visit. And so I agree with you entirely, okay, that we've not come to terms with it's almost as if we find the conversation a lot more uncomfortable than the colonizers. I confess to much Anglophilia more than I should have, but everybody welcomes the conversation, even though it's going to be uncomfortable. They know it's inevitable, but we aren't having enough conversation about something.
Well, I think for me,
and then I'm going to open up.
I think for me,
I'm going to open up.
For me, when you have political leadership who took decision to, erase history from syllabus, then you begin to wonder whether we actually understand the importance of our colonial history. And one of the poverty of Nigerian history today is lack of consciousness about the contributions of ordinary people, the sacrifices of ordinary people, that their voice have been totally erased from our memory and archives. what you have today in terms of when you come to talk about nationalism and the transfer of power are the big three, Zeke, Awolowo, and what have you. But Amadu Bello. But what about people that were massacred in Aba, people that were massacred in what do you call it, in Sokoto, the Atairu revolt, and some other.
Aba was not just Aba, it was from Aba.
So the political leadership, the moment you take a decision to take history out of your syllabus, then we cannot really say whether we appreciate our historical heritage, whether we understand the importance of memory, of letting our people know what we went through in order to inspire the spirit of that national loyalty and consciousness. I mean, just like in Ireland, we listened to Ambassador telling us what happened over 100 years of Irish history. I wonder whether we have political leadership who can actually talk about its local governments, not to talk about the state or national history. So the tragedy of nation building today is that we have leaders who does not understand our history.
And if you don't, and it's a well-known phrase, if you don't know where you've come from, it's difficult to know where you're going. Okay. Audience. Yes. 1, 2, 3. Yes, please.
Connect some dots.
Yes, please. Can you just wait for the speaker?
I want to connect some dots. Firstly, my name is Kian Thomaselli. I'm from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And firstly, it's very nice to have a session where there are actual real people talking to us. Part of the Zoom feed, very tiring. So that's the first. Okay. All right. So this whole session has been absolutely fascinating, particularly because I'm not a Nigerian scholar and I'm not a scholar of Irish history, but my wife is a scholar of Irish history. Ruth Tia Thomaselli from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and she and a colleague have just finished a book comparing prison museums between Ireland and South Africa. And in 2 weeks' time, they are organizing the Irish South Africa Conference in Durban. And one of the activities will be going up to the Zulu battlefields, where all these prior binaries about white versus black race as the issue start falling apart when we look at the composition of those armies. Including the Irish. The Irish were there too, the Indians were there. The British had Zulu regiments, the Zulus had some colonists. So the whole kind of thing about race resonated here. But in terms of contemporary South Africa, where racial attitudes have hardened even more than they were during apartheid. You talk about hospitable narratives, different narratives which can engage with each other. In South Africa, we have only inhospitable narrative. There's one inhospitable narrative. The West is bad. There was nothing good in colonialism of any kind. And one of our opposition politicians took a lot of heat because she talked about the benefits of colonialism to Singapore compared to South Africa's falling apart. And she got pilloried. So that brought me to another concept, Kant about the indeterminacy of translation. So your example, Peter, of here's the English speaker, there's the Irish speaker, and the translator in between, and nobody knows what's going on. I've experienced precisely that conundrum when I was working in Botswana with desert communities, and I took South African Tswana speakers with me, who were PhDs, and they had to find other Tswana speakers in the community who'd worked on the Witwatersrand mines to translate the Botswana Tswana. Now, when we explain this to people who haven't been in these conditions, they just think you're nuts. They have no idea. And so the other myth that is constantly bandied about South Africa is that my language is my culture. And your examples, every one of your examples is completely nonsense, made that nonsense. I don't feel at all Irish. I don't feel at all English. I don't feel all American. But I'm told that I'm white and, an interloper. So, those are the points I really wanted to make. Let me just check that. So we're speaking the same language, but we're not. This kind of discussion is so important in a context like South Africa. And this is one of the reasons why when other Africans come to South Africa to study or to work or as refugees, they are resented. And the xenophobia is brilliant from universities to the streets. Because the foreigners, as they call foreigners, in Zulu they call kwera, dirty people, have replaced the white colonialism to an extent. So the new colonizers are you guys. But you guys can teach us so much about how to actually navigate our way out of the mess into which we put ourselves, and we're compounding it, we're not resolving it. So I think we should repeat this discussion across South Africa. And so one of the points I want to make about the conference was that the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland will be visiting during the period of the conference, and certainly the conference had lots more money than that. But what's he coming there for? We think he's coming to talk to Ramaphosa about taking a non-aligned position along with South Africa claimed and other countries vis-a-vis the Ukraine and Russian war. So, I'm just, my head is buzzing. I want
people who know about say I am very old. I sleep it, and I tell people no, I wish I did, but the fact that I don't doesn't stop me feeling so that I can say I'm not person. It's interesting. I'm actually sure that's it.
Experiencing cultural studies, which is one of my disciplines, is precisely the lived relationship. People community in the context in which one is living with in language, how one makes meaning, class, relationship, production, mode of production. And that's precisely why language cannot be lost. The culture works through language in order to express the feeling.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes, I love it. Yes, can you say that again? I need to. Yes.
I'll write it down.
Okay. Yeah, well, I give this here because I don't know. Yes. You are second.
Hi, I'm Marta from the University of Oslo. Yeah, I've been watching a lot of Peaky Blinders, so I know my expert in Irish history. But I was interested in this question of have we come to terms with our own colonial history? And I think that's very interesting, both those locations in a way. Yeah. I think his name is Olufemi Taiwo has written this very interesting book against decoloniality, against decolonialism, and looking at sort of the enmeshment of colonial structures with new cultures that evolved, that were somehow part of it. So I'm wondering if I could hear some thoughts on that. I feel I'm in social studies, and I feel like a lot of what's happening now is part of a kind of strategic essentialism of decoloniality, that kind of back to the roots, back to purity, also the connections to African America. So we need to find the realness. So is that a kind of strategically essentializing of what African is or what Nigerian is, which is part of nation building, a lot of states. that continue to do that today. And whether we can like do that at the same time deal with how can we reject colonialism while at the same time and ask these questions while at the same time opening for the nuances of not post-colonial but mixed colonial cultures.
Yeah. So first of all, some comments about connections. My name is Akola. I work with the Function Innovation Center. First, some comments about connections. I've spent some time at Durban at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where I got my master's degree. And I know Professor Tomaselli very well. And I think you actually were supervisor to one of my friends who left here to do his PhD there. And the thing, and what he says about Nigerian students being the new colonizers there.
No, that's the perception.
The perception resonates very well with me. I would also like to say, of course, that I watched Professor. I should not say Professor Olafo SCN. That's how I refer to him in my head. Yes. So the comment the question I would like to ask is, so there's a talk about the cartography of the coloniality of the cartography, right? How the maps have hidden meanings from the structures of coloniality. I mean to say that maps are not just drawings of lands, and they're also structures of power. In that said, I wonder how the laws, for example, that we got from the new laws that we got, how those sort of things are embedded in the laws that we now have. Of course, they have evolved over time, but they still retain those potency of, for example, in the language. I should say. And I think that Ireland would have more instances about the coloniality of laws. For example, anyone who takes a keen history, what's the Irish literature would realize how the Irish are perceived as drunks and rebellious and radical and all that, and how such conception is instituted in the laws. For example, even in Lagos, there's a Yoruba proverb that talks about how you shouldn't come to Lagos because Lagos is full of laws, talking about the colonial administration's marking of different places where you should not go, at what time, curfews and all of that. So the question I'm asking is, taking from the cartography, how has that translated into the laws? If Professor would like to would respond to that.
Thank you. So the floor is open, gentlemen. Let's start with maps and structures of power. How has the cartography translated into how has cartography translated into the powers of laws, and how has that affected administration of those laws? And how has colonialism, do I have your question right, madam? How has colonialism be juxtaposed with post-colonialism, and can there be a way that we can look at ourselves?
Yeah, like how can we reject colonialism without dismissing intertwined?
Yeah.
Yes. So, open floor.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at both of them very quickly. I'm sure.
And everybody else can do the same.
Yeah, I think it's heritage. How you can reject colonialism as a system of government and domination and deprivation that is not acceptable to human dignity. And at the same time, there is the pollination, the cross-pollination, the infusion, the osmosis that happens with living with people that results in what is now called heritage. Again, Adeke makes a remark. I'm speaking English and I'm wearing a suit. I'm not going to stop wearing suits because I don't like colonialism. And I scarcely, I'm not going to, I work in English, so I'm not going to stop that. So there is an inevitable inheritance that colonies get with decolonization. It is our inheritance. And whether you like it or whether they accept it or not, and I think they do, the ex-colonials themselves they didn't leave here without taking some heritage from here as well.
Yeah.
They try and downplay it, but an average, I tell you, I kid you not, a conversation with anybody above the age of 60 in much of England, 4 out of 10 of them will tell you, oh, Nigeria, I used to live in Nigeria. Oh, my grandfather would grow up in Nigeria.
Yeah.
He was, so, it's always something they don't put on the surface, but when you get to know each other, there's some parts of us that they have.
Absolutely.
You'd be shocked how much, I have friends who go around doing auctions for artifacts and just memorabilia. And you'd be shocked how much people have in their attic. Just in the attic, something that Granny left there, and I don't want to throw it away. How much you want? £10? Take it. So that's the cross pollination, and I don't think that's bad. I don't think that's bad because I think we live in a world where cross cultures have done us all a world of good. Photography. You said something I'd never thought about. The maps of
Structures of power.
Structure of power. That is really, really powerful. And you're absolutely right. Because one of the things that the colonialists did in Nigeria is that they did do maps, very inaccurate maps that suited them. But inside those maps, they used the maps for ethnographic studies, which they then called intelligence reports. And those intelligence reports were instruments of they were like handover notes for the next coming person. So once I leave the residency of, say, Ibadan province, I leave that behind, and that's where the next guy takes off from. He doesn't interrogate behind what grew those maps, and the ethnography is part of the map making. It's really they translated into laws because don't forget Nigeria is a patchwork of different dependencies, different possessions of British. Lagos, the colony, Southern Protectorate, the Northern Protectorate, they were all sewn together, and the laws were totally different. I made the point in a recent talk by again that and it's going away now. It's gone.
Okay. Then Ambassador.
Yes, that the Land Use Act of 1978 actually started in 1912 in northern Nigeria. The exact same phrase, the consent of the governor. You will hold land, all the land belongs to the governor, and you will hold land as an allotee, and you can only transfer it with the consent of the government. And 7 decades later, in Nigeria, it became the new land tenure system for the whole country. So there you go.
And it's interesting your point. A girl I went to school with, an English girl, years later after we left, she was on my Facebook and said, oh, her father built the power station at Ijora. Yeah, random.
Anyway, I think I will start with the issue of map. As we are sitting here, you probably might be aware that the whole of Nigeria is probably mapped by the United States or Great Britain. Every great military intelligence starts with mapping. Okay, and when colonial guys came, the first thing to do is to map out the area. When you have a piece of land, it's just a piece of land. But when you put it on a map, it becomes something else. Because map goes beyond the drawing. It's a symbol of power. It's a symbol of territoriality. And when you have the map, it's easy for you to impose what Foucault will call governmentality, the control, the imposition of order. Because in the map, you locate the mineral resources, which is essentially what the colonialism is all about, the extraction of it. In the map, you locate where you have your military, location, which is an enforcement arm of your extraction, extractive initiative. And in the map, you locate where you will go, where you want to settle to stay away from the native disease. Okay, don't forget Ikoyi, for instance, was mapped out by the colonial government, and by 1930s, the colonial government already secured Ikoyi as a reservation area. Same thing happened in Sierra Leone. And they got to Sierra Leone, they realized that the town is suitable for not just for mosquito control, but for military location, so as to be on top, look at the natives and monitor the activities. So map is an imperial control document. There is no map today that does not have either economic extraction or military domination, concept behind it. It goes beyond, and every government, even presently in post-colonial period, you might build your house in any particular area of Lagos or Ogun State, but be rest assured that the map of that area is with the state government. Whether they come to you or not is immaterial, but they have it, because that is the symbol of authority, ability to control where you go, where you locate your house, and where not to build. It started from the colonial period. And in terms of culture, I think it was Professor Ade Ajayi, who was in his library one day, and myself and late Professor Lawa, we saw a picture of Professor Ajayi's daughter in a wheelbarrow being pushed by Professor Graham Smith's son. And Ade Ajayi wrote, "Colonialism in reverse." So in it, now, when you have friends, we have friends from all over the world, probably you, at the lunch, you saw them eating amala, eating semo. And if you look at your social media, you see some Owambe party where you have white guys dancing to the video and even spraying money in the party. That is cultural diffusion. Okay, but again, that does not remove the fact that they are Europeans and we are Africans. But cultural diffusions is not something that can be termed to decolonialism. You can decolonize, but that doesn't mean you cannot refuse cultural influence across the Atlantic. It is a natural thing. I work in the North. You probably see this kind of embroidery. It tells you something about either Muslim heritage or Northern heritage, but that doesn't remove the fact that I am a Lagosian. Yeah.
Thank you. Ambassador.
No, I think, look, it reminds me of the great quote from George Bernard Shaw that he says, "The longer I live, the more I'm convinced that this earth is run by other people as a lunatic asylum." I think we make very hard work of what's quite difficult. And I think there's a lot of people, and thanks to them, they go in depth into a lot of these things. But I think at the essence of it, it's about people and the experience that they've had, and that the exposure that they've had, and the opportunity that they've had. And it seems to me, in shaping the way we look at the world, we've been influenced over the hundreds and hundreds of years. We didn't have a parliamentary democratic system in our traditional culture. So guess what? We were influenced by that. We didn't have full participatory democracy in terms of voting in our traditional culture. That's been a pretty positive thing. But we did have learning. We did have the role of women in our culture. Women could be landowners in our culture. We had communal landowning. Before there was a single university opened on the big island next door to us, we had centers of learning in our country. We had the only territory in Europe which wasn't invaded by the Romans. We have the distinction, you'll enjoy this one, remember this one. The first map that was made of Ireland, they were such experts in Ireland, they didn't call Ireland Ireland. They called it Scotland. And they called Scotland Hibernia, they called it Ireland. Because such was the influence of the Irish in Scotland. The Romans drew a map because they'd never been to Ireland, and they said, the Irish are in Scotland, and the Scots, whoever they are, must be in this other place that's out there somewhere. So it's very interesting. And for me, it informs so much of our contemporary worldview and perspective. All of those waves of immigration over the years, all those influences, our people going out into the world, people coming to us. So if you look in the first 3 pages of that, you'll see names like Ryan are in there. You'll see names like Brennan, Stapleton. You just name it. We spot these names a mile away. My generation will be looking for Nigerian names in here because we have Nigerian people now as part of our family in Ireland, part of our global family. And we, because of our colonial experience, we try to be inclusive in how we look at the world. We don't set the other. We don't come with pejorative views of other people. We don't start from that. Our first female president, it only took us 90 years to get a female president, but we're slow learners. But then when we got it, we moved really, really quickly. And then we had 2 brilliant, very young people, one after the other. Mary Robinson, probably the one you've heard of the best, who went on to the UN as well. But she talks all the time about Ireland being a first world country with a third world memory. That's why we're interested in Palestine. That's why we're committed to Africa. That's why we're militarily neutral. That's why we've taken in 100,000 people from the Ukraine. Think about it. Actually, no, it's not. Don't be. But it's interesting because it's informed by where we come from. It's not random.
No, it's the memory, and I think it's what we are trying to talk about here. It's the coming to terms with it, and I think it's what Mr. Shasha says and what Dr. Juha says. We have not been able to come to those terms and then take the next steps. Whereas it seems as if Ireland has been able to reflect and decide what way it should now go.
To start.
In other words, what shaped the perspective in Ireland is the colonial heritage, the past, the memory of the past shaping the future of Ireland.
And we know what we don't want to be. We know what we don't want to be. And it doesn't mean you read the writings of Casement as you have, you read the writings of everybody, even up to modern day in Ireland. The argument is not with the British people. The argument was with British rule. It wasn't even with an individual British government. It was with British rule, the implementation of it, which is actually quite a sophisticated thing. And I think if we get a bit of room to breathe sometimes in Nigeria, because there's a lot going on and scale is a challenge, it's a lot easier to address these things in a smaller polity with less maybe side crossing issues and so on. You know, the sheer volume. If you think of the Ukrainian equivalent of refugees in Nigeria will be 2.5 million people in 6 months.
Yeah.
Okay, so scale is an advantage.
Because the population of Ireland
Ireland's 8 million people. So, you know, if you think of Singapore, #1 competitive economy in the world, Ireland's #2, New Zealand's maybe #4, #5. What have they all got in common? They've got between 5 and 8 million people as populations. The other two are almost city-states. Ireland is so small you could fit 15 of us or 20 of us into probably the northern states of Nigeria. So that's an advantage.
Yeah.
That it didn't occur to us during the colonial rule.
It's the mobility.
When it didn't look like we had any advantages. And I think that's one of the things that we have to make sure that whatever we do, we don't look on other people as the other and allow those things to be attributed, including, I would say, in the conflict with Russia and the war of aggression with the Ukraine. We can't allow this to color what we think of the Russian people, because our argument is not with the Russian people, and it never has been. It's with the rulers, it's with the leadership there. And the sooner that it's resolved, in our experience, violence will just beget more violence.
Indeed.
And it didn't exactly work out for people bringing violence to us. So, and nor did it in Nigeria.
No.
So why can we not find a way to navigate our way through that together?
And I think that's a great place to stop. I think the lesson to take away is not other people. I'd like to thank Ambassador Ryan, Dr. Jimo, and I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you.
Oh, good job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So see you again.